Welcome to Built to Win, the podcast created to help you level up your business game by creating a success mindset made for the long run. In this episode, Neora co-CEO Deborah Heisz sits down with author, speaker, and educator Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe to talk about cultivating everyday resiliency. Dr. Robyne, who specializes in resiliency and workplace wellness, shares her inspiring personal story that underscores her message: we can do hard things. Listen as she shares the practices we can use to become more resilient in both our personal and professional lives.
I'm very excited today to be here with our special guest. For those of you who know me and have been around me very much, you know this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, how building our resilience is fundamental to our success, and how can we do that? How do we develop the skills for that? It's one of the most frequent questions I get whenever I talk about it. And I'm excited to have the expert on the show today to help us figure that out. Welcome, Robyne.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So I think it's fair for our listeners to get an idea of why this is your focus of study. I mean, I've heard your story and it's fascinating to me. Share with us a little bit about how'd you start getting in the resilience space?
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey into being somebody who studies human resiliency and performance was definitely not linear. And again, I know you're familiar with my story, but just for our listeners, I was somebody who experienced a lot of adversity during my adolescent season. It was a very, very dark season. I really struggled academically. And I think what happens so often is when we struggle academically, we start to struggle socially as well. And it was just this really difficult time for myself and my family. And I was very fortunate though, because my family loved me so hard, but helplessly. But eventually we got to that point where my family decided to relocate and we moved to a new community where I was able to do the work. I was able to get clean. I got sober. I started getting ready to re-enroll in school because I had dropped out in grade 10. And I was starting to build my comeback. And it was a very exciting time for my family. And then unfortunately or fortunately, I ended up experiencing this like catastrophic car accident. And I was in a situation where I was a new driver. I was driving home late at night and just with this brand new license, and a snowstorm rolled in. And where I'm from, the snowstorms are plentiful. And unfortunately, though, I didn't know how to drive well in the snow. And my vehicle ended up sliding off the road. I went down an embankment and it ended up crashing in through the ice of the Otonabee River. And I was trapped, drowning in my car. And in that moment, I noticed that like I wasn't feeling scared. In that moment, I was really more angry. And I was really angry because I felt like I couldn't protect my mom from what was about to happen. And I tell you, when you're going through a difficult season and you have people who stand by you, we want to protect them sometimes more than we want to protect ourselves. And when I started to think about my mom in this moment, so if you imagine like drowning, entombed in a car, I started to think about my mom. And one of the first things that came top of mind is how she used to always tell me that I could do hard things, that no matter what, Robyne can do hard things. And in that moment, I just really leaned into that, borrowed her confidence almost to see if I could figure out a way out of that situation. Now, I wasn't able to like get my seatbelt off or even open the door because the water pressure had already started to crush this vehicle. But I was able to take my fingertips, dig them where the window met the door, pull off the window from the track so I could pull it down the door. I was able to swim out the window. And what was quite remarkable that evening is that there just happened to be a gentleman by the name of Joseph. And he was driving along the road. He see my car tracks in the snow. And Joseph ended up pulling his truck over. He saw me out there holding onto the edge of this iced water. And Joseph grabbed wood and a chain from the back of his pickup truck. And he used the wood to make an X to support his body weight. And he crawled out onto that ice. He slid out the chain. He wrapped it around my body and he dragged me to shore. Now, he was awarded the Governor General's Award for bravery for risking his life to save a stranger, which is the highest accommodation for bravery. And what was so remarkable, when I woke up a wee while later in the hospital, my mother was there. And one of the things she asked me was how I did it. How did you get yourself out of that? And in that moment, I recall sharing with her, it's because you told me I could do hard things. Now, in full disclosure, she did lean in afterwards and say, that's not really what we ever had in mind when we used to tell you that. But that so very much became the origin story for why I became so curious about the human condition, because I didn't think that I had any particular special set of skills or abilities yet. In this moment, I was able to figure it out. I was able to figure out my next right step each and every way. And I wanted to learn more about it. So I ended up getting back into school, and I cobbled together, a high school transcript, was able to make it to a college. And then right from then on, it was just learning as much as I could about this from both a personal experience, but also that professional lens, because all I want to do now is help other people find what they have within themselves to be able to show up even in the hardest moments of our lives.
I absolutely love that because for me, we started a property called Live Happy, which is, a
Yes.
sister company to Built to Win. And for me, that was a big driver for me. I realized that there was something inside of me that always looked at challenge as something to be faced, not something to run away
Yeah.
from, not something to, and failure was okay.
Mhm.
And I didn't understand why other people would, like, even at the brink of success, stop because they got hard, because it
Yeah.
got hard. You see so many people who build, great businesses, and then when it gets hard or when something happens, they give up as
Yeah.
opposed to going forward. And
Yeah.
that just wasn't in my DNA. And I love that
Mhm.
your mom put that in your DNA, that
Yeah.
you can do hard things. My parents did the same for me. I grew up believing that I could do anything. Of course, in my case, it's you can do anything if you can ever just figure out what you want to do.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
know, but that was a big part of my upbringing. And it almost made me sad when I recognized in other people that they didn't know that they could do that, but they
Mhm.
can. They didn't know that they could accomplish whatever it is they needed to do to get to that next level, or when the business started to have problems to build it back, or when their personal life started to have problems to build it back. And it's so huge um, in life to be able to do that, that to give the
Yes.
opportunity to teach other people or to learn more about it. For me, it was like, other people know about this. I want to learn everything about it so that we can
Mhm.
tell everybody else about it.
Exactly.
And,
Absolutely.
and it's such a huge thing in life to be able to say, hey, you can do this, and to
Mhm.
give that to people. So we talk a lot about that, right? We talk a lot about resiliency and
Yeah.
how important it is in life and how, but what we don't really talk about is, how do you get it? I mean,
Mhm.
I was raised with it. It was my environment. You were raised with it,
Yeah.
whether it's environmental because you had to go through hard things or whatever it is, but you knew somewhere that you could do something hard.
Yeah.
How do we have people who are not wired that way?
Mhm.
What tools can we give them? How do we help them build their resiliency?
Yeah, I love everything about how you just summed that up, because that's exactly what this is all about. It's like some of us are given, opportunities where, we are in these like family systems where we talk about, those values and those characters that like we're fighters, right? Like my family was talked so openly about, as, family coming from Scotland to a new country, like we were hardy people, like we
Yeah.
figure stuff out. That was like, again, it was just in this kind of almost like the ecosystem of our family. But what I think is so important to hold space for is like, I still got off track. So even though I grew up in this super solid, really dialed in, character driven family system, I still was like rudderless for a period of time. Like I still found my way into this dark season. And so what I think is so important is what you're just saying there is like, okay, well, what do we do to rebuild or create these kind of comebacks, these ability to be able to bounce back? And what I've been able to discover in my research is there's actually 5 what we call pillars, that these are practices that we kind of do each and every day that sets us up for success. So I can tell you a wee bit about each of them if that's okay.
Be great. I'd
Yeah.
love to hear it. And I do think one thing you said, I just want to make sure everybody heard that. I'm wired that way. You're wired that way,
Mhm.
but we still get off track. There
Yes.
is no one who spends their entire life on track. There is no on track for 80 years, for 100 years. It doesn't exist. We
Exactly.
all have challenges of varying size and at various times in our life. So when we're talking about resilience, it's not a one-time thing. It's something that you get the opportunity to utilize.
Yeah.
Opportunity may not be the right word, but it's you
It
get the
is.
opportunity to utilize through many stages in your life and through many times in your life, whether it's the loss of a loved one, whether it's, the loss of a career, whether it's, not being where you want to be at a certain age. All of those things are opportunities, and all of us get off track. So I just think it's really important, because I do think some people think that when they look at highly successful people, they think there's some magic there or some luck there, or they were born that way. And that's just not true. So I just wanted to emphasize that before we got back to your 5 points, because it's such an important thing for people to recognize, that they're not any different than the successful person they see down the street. They just haven't gotten there yet.
100%. And a way to when I'm explaining this to other groups, before we dive into the pillars, I can share with you, I think about it as the difference between like chess and poker. So chess is what we call perfect knowledge. As in, we can see every move on the board. We can like make really great predictions in terms of, if I move this, this is what you're going to do, because we see all the variables. It's considered a game of perfect knowledge. We don't know what they're going to do per se, but there's a pattern, and there's like these really rigid rules that like we essentially know how this is going to unfold. Life, I think, is a lot more like poker. Like, we have no idea what hand we're going to be dealt. There's some guiding rules and principles, but it's this idea about like, how do you show up with the hand that you are dealt? It would be lovely if everything was like chess, maybe not, because perhaps some of the variety that we see in life is what makes it exciting. But I look at this idea that so many, especially when I'm working with parents and like family systems or even business owners, they want the chess game. They want perfect knowledge. The reality is we need to get a lot better at playing poker. Now, I'm not encouraging poker behavior, but that's that idea that we're working with imperfect pieces of knowledge, and we do our best to show up. And there's so many variables outside of our control, but there are quite a few variables within our control. And that's what we focus on. And that what really leads us into the 5 pillars. So the first one we talk about is a sense of belonging. You have to have someone that's in the game with you. Like, you cannot do this alone. And so when we think about entrepreneurship, when we think about business, you have to have a trusted ally. Like, maybe that's a member of your home team. It might be your family system, but it's the person that accepts you even in the bad days, even in the hard times, like somebody who's going to stand with you. And what we see in the research, that one caring, consistent person will make the world of difference. And I'll share with you one of the observations I've seen recently is, especially with business owners, we have a lot of friends that are like 9 to 5 friends. I refer to them as like the 9 to 5 people. Sure, I can call them if I'm going through a hard time. Sure, I could probably reach out for some support. But the question is, you need a 3 a.m. phone call person. Like, you have to call somebody that you can call at 3 a.m. and just be like, this is not okay, or whatever you're going through. And you trust that they're going to show up. They're not even going to ask questions. Like, they're just going to show up for you. And what the research shows is, if you have that one person in your world that will stand with you, you're pretty much unstoppable when it comes to what you have to navigate. So that first one is belonging.
So if you're someone who's sitting there going, I know exactly who that person is in my life, that just reinforces what I know, what they know. But what about if you're sitting there and you're the person who goes, I don't know who that person is in my life. How do I find that person? Where do I look to find and build that relationship? What do I need to do? And how can I have that in my life? Because that's really what I feel like I'm missing.
There you go. So my first question would be to ask, are you that person for someone else? So there's many of us who we are very good at giving, especially when we're in these service roles in these industries where we're in it to win. We're in it to build and to set people up for success. You're likely that for other people. So my question is there a person, like one person in that network, that you are willing to be vulnerable with enough to be like, hey, I need to be able to receive that type of support in my life? Because I often see people say, hey, Robyne, I don't have that person. And then I ask them, are you that person? And then they start listing all of these people that they would show up for. It's like, okay, pick one of those as a start. And then if you don't have that available to you, okay, then that would be like this invitation to do like just a little bit of an inventory. Because what that tells me is we've done a lot of transactions in terms of relationships, but we haven't gone deep enough yet with the right ones. So we want to move away from just everything being transactional to actually start to make connection. And we're social beings. We're meant to be able to have these deep connections with other people. And again, some of it could be, it could be colleagues, it could be, it could be your partner, like whoever that person is, but just somewhere in your world, you need to be able to have a 3 a.m. phone call.
I love that. Be that for somebody else is really key. And I think that a lot of people are that for somebody else. And if they're not, maybe they should figure out who they could be that for and develop the relationship that way. That's totally congruent with what we call a workout partner.
Yes.
The person you call when you're like, okay, this ain't working, help me work it out. Right.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Such a key part of not just business, but life. I mean, who you're going to call at 3 a.m.
Yeah. And again, I think so many business owners are really good at the 9 to 5 phone calls, right? Like the 9 to 5, it's the willing to be vulnerable enough to have a 3 a.m. phone call.
And I think it's really hard as a business owner. It's really hard when you're the leader to have that. I read once that, the CEO is the loneliest person in the business. The owner is the loneliest person in the business because you feel like you have to be that for everybody. But the reality is you still need that for yourself.
Yeah. And if you're in that position, because yes, you're absolutely right. The top is very, very lonely. That's when we want to really make sure that we have nurtured those relationships outside of that work dynamic, or maybe a colleague or a friend, maybe in a different industry, right? One that's not on your payroll, because having people to share that success with is actually how we can maintain top performance, right? Making sure we have somebody to be able to, when you get to the top, you want to make sure you're not alone. Right? Because the reality will be a lot harder to stay in that position if you don't have those supports in other places in your life.
We could probably talk about this one all day because I'm a big believer in this. But what's item number 2?
Item number 2 is what we discovered in the research was perspective. Now, this one often gets kind of almost like boiled down to be like mindset or attitude. But what we discovered is this beautiful kind of alignment with perspective of being your head and your heart. So this ability to be able to like see the world, but also feel your way through it. And resilient people trust their intuition. They use critical thinking, problem solving, they're willing to work the problem. And they recognize intuitively how to make what matters most matter most, like what to prioritize, even that kind of idea of like, who needs me right now on my A game? We can't be on our A game for everybody in every single conversation, but even just having that intuitiveness and the insight and self-awareness to recognize where am I needed and how do I have to show up for that person or that situation? That perspective was the second pillar that we see in our research.
When it comes to perspective, what clues can people use to help improve their perspective? How can they get better at this? Because I'm intuitive. A lot of people are intuitive. Some just flat out are not intuitive, and they need different clues to help them develop this skill set.
100%. I love this question. So first of all, our perspective grows in relation to our lived experience. So the more experiences we have, the more fumbles, the more we've been able to like not waste a mistake and learn from our mistakes. Like, again, this is why I get so nervous when people think, they're so nervous to fail or drop the ball. It's like, that's where you're going to get the best learning, right? We don't learn when everything is going smooth sailing. And it's that old kind of adage that, calm waters don't make good sailors. Like we need storms in our lives to really challenge us and push our thinking. And it also expands our worldly view, right? When we start taking in other perspectives and kind of seeing bigger picture, how do we start doing that? The first thing is it's actually to, again, use strategies that allow you to broaden your horizons by having friends, for example. And I said this recently, like, if you're a Republican, I want you to have Democratic friends. And if you're a Democrat, I want you to have Republican friends. Like, you have to hear the world from different vantage points, because if we're only ever looking from one perspective, then we have what I would call a perception. We don't have perspective. So we, each and every one of us, we have a perception of things. But as soon as we start to take this bigger view, our perspective is going to grow. And a way to do that, again, is talking to people from different, belief systems, different places and spaces, just to really broaden our horizons, but also that act of self-awareness, like recognizing our blind spots. And I think it's so important, especially for business owners and leaders, that there is some checks and balances on your blind spots. And what's interesting though, the higher you go, the more like head nodding and yes people you're going to be surrounded by, because there's this innate power in that dynamic. You have to have some way to check your blind spots. As a mother of 3 teenagers, I have plenty of blind spot checkers who are so good at pointing out things for me. And even one of my best teammates that I work with, every once in a while when I'm needing some feedback, I'll say, hey, I'm asking you to please help me see what I'm not seeing here. Help me know where I need to improve, what I need to put my energy or my focus on, because I'm trusting you to be that person that helps me increase my vision in those blind spots.
I love that. And I also have 3 teenagers willing to point out exactly where I'm missing the point right now. So completely understood that comment.
So good.
So what is the next point? What is number 3?
So number 3 on the list is that we see is the practice of acceptance. Now, this one, a lot of folks get hung up on this one when we think about our resiliency, because as high performers, probably one of the feelings that we like to experience the least is helplessness. And when we start to dive into acceptance, there is a perception of helplessness because we don't like not being in control. But part of acceptance is actually recognizing and actually being able to decipher those different types of control points. So where do you have control, agency, influence, and what is outside of your control? What are the things that you aren't able to impact or influence, and working within your controllables? And that becomes a daily practice because, again, intuitively, we're not going to like the things that we do not like or circumstances that are outside of my control, right? Even things like supply chain, right? Political unrest, like the unwellness of the world. There are so many things that we cannot control. And the idea and what resilient people do is they put, again, their agency, their influence, their action to where they're going to get the best return on their investment.
I love that one. It is really critically important for me, to not focus on things that I really can't do anything about, other than as a problem solving. Okay, we can't do anything about that. So what can we do instead?
Exactly.
And asking those questions as you go through that process. Okay, I know we can't do anything about, the hurricane, right? It's going to be here, but what can we do to mitigate its impact on us? Those are the types of questions that we need to go through to be resilient, but also to keep, in my personal belief, is to keep moving forward. Because if you're not moving and you're standing still, I think you become even less empowered. Like if you're
100%.
waiting, and I think empowering yourself to control what you control is the way I like to put it, is like empower yourself to do what you can do, and maybe the rest of the world will follow. Maybe not, but at least you're doing what you can do.
Oh, exactly. And what we see so often is like people get so stuck. And again, they'll get stuck in those like why questions, like why is this happening, or why did that unfold, or why did they get the funding, or why did they get the promotion? And often when we get stuck in that reverse type of thinking, again, we are in our own way of being able to move forward. And again, what I see so often, especially with when we see like where mental health is right now, which right now folks are in just such a precarious place. When people are stuck in the past, right, they're more prone to depression. When people are too stuck in the future, they're prone to anxiety, right? So it's this idea of working within what is in front of me. So that way, I can show up as you said, in the most empowered way to make the best decision in the moment, and recognize that we won't always have all the information, right? So again, this isn't chess, it's poker. We don't have perfect information. We're just going to play the hand we're dealt, and we're going to show up. And that's what we see resilient people do.
So I want to obviously get to points 4 and 5, but I also want to do a little aside here, because I want to talk about resilience and stress and how they're related. Because when you talked about being too future focused brings anxiety, bringing too past focus brings depression, but those are both stress, right? They're both outcomes of stress. So I know you've done a lot of research on this as well. How are the two interrelated? How are stress and resilience interrelated? And what impact does that have on how we deal with stress, our
Yeah.
ability to be resilient or not, and dealing with stress.
Yeah, I could I love this question and we can talk for days, but the best way I can describe it is that our capacity to be resilient is in direct relation to our threshold of stress. And what I mean by that is if we think about our nervous system is designed to keep us safe. Right? Like our nervous system is our first line of defense. It wants to protect us. So when people say to me like, "Oh, Robyne, I want to be stress-free," I'm like, that doesn't exist. Like our biology isn't set up that way. Our physiology doesn't allow us to be like stress free. What we want to do is work within the scope of what our stressors are telling us and how it allows us to like enhance performance, not hinder performance. And when we're in that place of what we would call distress, which means that our levels of cortisol are so elevated. And again, this could be not just from like, this could be just emails, right? It could be the Sunday scaries before we get back ready to go back into the office on Monday. Like whatever that stressor is, our bodies will produce cortisol that's going to give us energy. It's meant to put us into action, but it's the doses of cortisol that we're getting on a daily basis. Every time you scroll your phone, every time you hear a newscast, every time you chat with somebody and they're telling you all about the horrible, no good things that are happening in the world, we just kept getting hit with this cortisol. And then our body crosses this threshold into what we call the place of distress. And when we're in there, we are not our most resilient selves. Like at that point, we're just trying to survive. We're not growing. We're not learning. We're not evolving. We're not leveling up. We are just essentially in like crisis management mode, which is we're just trying to get through. And unfortunately, what I've seen in the last wee while in my research is that we're meant to visit distress, right? Like we're meant to get to those little, moments in the day of overwhelm, but then we rally, we re-regulate, and we're good to go. What's happening now? People are just making distress the norm and they are spending all of their time in that place. And that's why we're seeing folks that are so reactive. People become so positional. Everything feels really competitive. Everything feels urgent. Like those are all cues that we are spending way too much of our time in that place of distress, and our ability to be resilient, to be our like healthiest, most wise self, it's not there.
So how do we get out of that? How does your average person get out of distress? I mean, for me, I do tell people to do this one thing, which I think is completely valuable for everybody. Mind what you put in your brain. Don't scroll. Don't don't listen to the world's going to end news on the way home in the car. Don't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, I understand you want to be informed, but you can probably hear the entire days of news in the first 15 minutes, and then you can turn it off and go about your day the rest of the day. So that's one of my tactics to avoid getting, being surrounded by these things I can't control that are all negative, that are being input into me every day by the outside. What are some other things people can do to get out of this distress?
Well, first, I just want to reinforce the heck out of that because you're absolutely right. It's like garbage in, garbage out, right? So, like being mindful of what we're taking in, that is a form of like what we can do in terms of self-preservation, right? And like I assure you, the rest of the world will keep you informed enough of what's going on that again, you don't need to be in that place of rumination, right? So, yeah, 100%. We want to minimize the negative inputs. So that's number one. Now, interestingly, our bodies naturally have, again, we have these like kind of working pharmacies where our bodies naturally want to be in a place of balance. It wants to heal itself. It doesn't want to be in distress. So things that people will do naturally, number one is get outside. Right. The research shows as soon as you go outside, your body's going to start to re-regulate, get rid of some of that built up cortisol. You're going to feel better. Now, let's say the nature of your job, you can't get outside much. Okay. Option number two we see is we actually cry. And it's a very particular cry. It's that red blotchy cry where we go like super snotty and patchy. It's called a cortisol cry. And essentially what happens is the cortisol is getting out of the largest organ in our body, which happens to be our skin. And it's our body's way of re-regulating, which explains why for many of us, when we feel overwhelmed, it feels like the back of our eyeballs are burning because our body is just trying to get out of the stress. But as a leader, I understand that it's very hard to go into your Monday morning meeting and be like, okay, everyone, let's just cry for a minute and then we're going to get to work. So the third thing that we naturally do is we eat carbohydrates. Like we eat all those yummy, delicious, wonderful things. And that just starts to help us have this break from the relentlessness of that cortisol that we feel, which explains a lot of people when they say, hey, Robyne, I struggle with like eating behavior at nighttime. That's when they love to take all their sugar intakes. Well, that's because we've associated our appetite with high levels of cortisol, and we eat carbohydrates to help break it down. And I get so nervous when people say to me things like, "Oh, I'm not taking carbs." Well, carbs are actually one of the most important things. It's the fuel our brains use.
Right.
And so we want to make sure. And again, what I think happens, I know I can only speak from personal experience, is that you have all of this cortisol and you're built up in your body. And then you get home at the end of the day and you're like ravenous. So you like eat that cookie and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can literally feel my stress melting away. So then I just overcommit to the rest of that row of cookies, right? So that's where we kind of get some of that behavior. No shame, no judgment. That's stress behavior. It's not misbehavior. And those are what we naturally do. Now, there's a few other things that we can do, and we call these forces of recovery in my work. And it's things like connection, right? A really amazing conversation with the right person can all of a sudden feel like a therapy session, right? Like it could literally just be like, oh, I needed that connection. And again, a podcast like this, right? As you're telling me a wee bit about the backstory is how you started this, right? And then it was like, wow, this became cathartic because it's connecting. It's this
Yeah.
connection with people. The other one we talk about is like a music. Music has this amazing way of helping us re-regulate our mood. So using music as a tool to help us process emotion is another way to re-regulate. And the other one also that I think is underutilized is solitude. We actually need a bit of time where we're not taking in new information. We're not scrolling. We're not taking in new information. We're actually just like essentially alone with our thoughts, just to allow us that chance to regroup, to rally, to settle. And then we can get back into the game. Then we get back into it. But we have to have some moments of solitude in the day.
Which might be hard with some teenagers, but in the house. But no, that is one of the reasons why, of course, meditation and mindfulness help
Yeah.
reduce stress. So I took us off track, but let's get back to our 5. So recapping, number 1 was have that person
Belonging.
call at 3 a.m. Number 2 was build or have perspective.
Yep.
Have perspective. Number 3 was
Acceptance.
acceptance
Working
of
with our
what you can
controllables.
control and what you can't control. So number 4 is,
and this is what I think the world needs such a big dose of right now, which is the pillar of hope. It's choosing to live hope-filled. We need practices that cultivate living a life that is full of hope. We need to trust that better days are ahead, that all of this is working towards some type of good. And I think what right now we're seeing, and this is what I get nervous about when I work with folks, is that we're seeing such high levels of despair. And despair is this kind of way that our body loses its ability to hold hope. And if we put too much of that negative and we start to go down that kind of that path, it's really, really detrimental to society. And we're seeing that all over. So cultivating a hope practice, whatever you do to just trust that, again, it's not this toxic positivity. It's not saying everything okay when it's not okay. It's that even in like the worst situations, there's still part of you that trusts that it's going to be okay, that on the other side of it, you're going to be all right, or your family's going to be okay. It's like holding that line that we will not give up hope. And again, when we start to see the state of the world, I think we're seeing these massive levels of despair, which is making living hope-filled more important than ever before.
So how does having vision, because not just some, hey, I want to get that one day, but having the clear vision of this is what I want for my family, or this is what I want for my business, and I'm going to do the steps and break it down to get there. How much is vision connected to hope?
100%. Like we need to be working towards something. And we actually know more often than not when we look at, for example, the research on happiness, contentment, satisfaction, it's very rarely the destination when it's achieved. It's the process of working towards it. It's the discipline, the motivation, the structure is what actually gives people like the best sense of accomplishment. And like, for example, let's say you just ran your first 5K, right? Like is crossing the finish line the big deal, or is it everything that it took that you did behind the scenes to make it so you were able to run your first race? Right. So I think so often we get focused on these finish lines, and it's the process. So yes, vision is so important. And again, this is beyond kind of like when I know right now lots of people are, I got to manifest the future. It's like, no, you got to fight for the future. You have
Yeah.
to fight for the things that matter most. And having, for example, like you having a system in place that makes you feel empowered, strong, capable, able to be well resourced is going to allow you to work towards that big, bright future.
And that gives you hope. I mean, essentially,
Exactly.
one of my, you brought up happiness. And of course, I think everybody listening to the podcast knows, that's my passion. And
Yes.
that true happiness, not, the ice cream. Hey, I just had an ice cream. I'm going to run around in circles because I'm six kind of happiness, or got off the
Yes.
roller coaster. Woo. No, we're talking about true happiness. One of my favorite definitions of happiness is it's the joy you feel when working towards your true potential.
Yeah.
It's not the destination.
Yeah.
It's the process that brings the joy. And I always love that. And I also connect that to hope, because if you
Yes.
feel like you're on your path, of course you believe you're going to get there. And that's where
Absolutely.
vision's important, and that's where joy comes from, and it's all interconnected.
Oh, it's this beautiful tapestry that I believe 100% is all interconnected. And again, that's when I think about, even when I finished my doctorate degree, right? So going from a high school dropout to like convocating, being a doctor, yeah, it was cool to walk across the stage. What it really was, what I was most proud of was the fact that I did that as a single mom. Like the
Oh,
fact
wow.
that I was able to build all of these systems in place that allowed me to be able to still show up for my family, still be able to work. But it was the process. It was that discipline and the motivation. And again, that vision of wanting to be someone who rewrites my educational story. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. And also to that notion of being like deeply content. And when you can subscribe to this idea, and this is one that I found really helpful to help with hope, is if you could subscribe to the idea that if it's meant for you, it will find you. And like again, if it's meant for you, it will work out. And if this opportunity passes you by, that wasn't the one that was meant for you, because it takes some of the pressure off. So even that we're working hard and fighting hard to build these big bright futures, there is this idea of surrendering, like surrendering in the fact that if it's meant for me, it's going to find me. No opportunity for me is going to bypass me if it was designed for me. And I have found that gave me so much confidence to lean into that practice of surrender, to enjoy the process more, knowing that I'm heading in the right direction.
I love that. Okay, so we've kept them waiting long enough. What is
Yeah.
number
Okay.
5?
Okay. And this is actually one of my favorites because it's such a wild card. Okay. This was like the absolute wild card in the research. Number 5 was humor. So we learned resilient people are so funny. But that, like, let me tell you though, it is a dark humor. Like literally, it is like HR violation type humor. Like it isn't your just like average kind of G kind of humor. Like they have this dark streak, but they use it for good. And at first, we thought it was just kind of like a bit of a defense mechanism that they never took anything too seriously, or even in these like dark situations, they would like say something off color or even funny. But what we learned is it actually had a biological underpinning. So, for example, when you laugh, your body releases a natural tranquilizer and it blocks your pain receptors. So, it doesn't solve your problems, but it gives people a moment of reprieve. And then they're in this really cool place where they're able to respond versus react. So it's just this little switch that they're able to activate to be able just to get a pause. And then they're able to make the next right decision. So this idea of humor, not taking themselves too seriously, letting things go, it's been quite remarkable that we see having a wee bit of fun in the process is actually a way that we can cultivate human resiliency.
So like self-deprecating humor, gallows humor, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, definitely not self-deprecating humor, right? So it wouldn't be self-deprecating, but it would literally be like, like for example, like, well, I'll give you this one. We learned that people who swear live longer, right? So, and it was interesting. We shared that on social media, and I think in the first week it had like 7 million views because clearly there's hope for many of us to live longer with our swearing. But it's just this idea of just like letting things go, right? So, and even I'll give you an example. I was working with a large group, health and safety, and I was telling them how swearing is good for our health. It helps us live longer. And this one gentleman said to me, he worked in construction, and he said, "You know what, lady? I love when they call me lady. I think it's adorable." He's like, "Hey, lady, listen to this." He's like, "If you're ever on my job site and you hear any of the trades saying oops-a-daisies or shoot or sugar, don't buy that house. You only want to buy the house when they're dropping F-bombs because they're locked in." And I love that idea of just the fact that if something goes wrong and people like express how they really feel and then they move on, right? So it's just this idea of just not carrying things that aren't ours to carry, especially when I think of business owners. One of the things I often share is like, I want you to care deeply about your teammates. I want you to care deeply about your clients, but I don't want you to carry it home with you. Like we have to have some way of letting go because we can't be on point every single minute of the day. Like we can't be all hands on deck all the time. We need to have time for rest and recovery.
Well, I love that. This has been a great conversation. Probably one of my favorite. I could talk to you for hours.
Oh, thank you.
It's been wonderful. And it's something that I think people need to understand is that we're all can develop our resiliency. We all can work towards that. And I can't make you funny, but I can tell you it's okay to swear is what I got out of that last one.
Absolutely. And eat carbs, right? If
And
that's
eat
the only
carbs,
two
and eat
things you
carbs.
got, swear and eat carbs, you're not wrong.
You're not wrong. But thank you so much for joining us today. I know our listeners are going to love everything you have to offer. This has been a great discussion. I hope to have you back in the future. Thank you for being on the show today, Robyne. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Take good care.
You too.
That was Deborah Heisz talking with Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe about resilience. If you'd like to learn more about Robyne, discover her books, or read some of her articles, visit her website at drrobyne.ca. That's drrobyne.ca. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you've learned something from it, please share it with a friend or colleague who you think would also benefit. And if you're new to Built to Win, we invite you to go back and listen to our story from the beginning. You can find us wherever you download your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please rate us and leave a review to let us know what you think of the show.